Throughout the history of the world, the rich and powerful have dominated it, and very few people have had any control of their own governments.
On my orders, coalition forces have begun striking selected targets.
On Tuesday night, I gave the order for British forces to take part in military action.
This is the story of the attempt to change that, to win power for the people as a whole. It's the story of a great idea, democracy. And the struggle to make this idea a reality has often been bitter and bloody. After 50 years in Parliament and 11 as a cabinet minister, I've had some experience of democracy, the limits to it and the threats to it. And all the power that I ever had, I got from those who voted for me and to whom I was accountable and from whom I learned everything. The basis of democracy is the belief that we were all born equal and that that equality must be accepted by those in power.
We should live peacefully. We don't want army. We don't want gunshot in the fight.
Probably the main lessons, if you don't keep up the pressure for democratic control, you lose it. It's use it or lose it. And that is something that people find hard to understand. There is never a final victory for democracy. It's always a struggle in every generation. And you have to take up the cause time and time and time again. And we've also learned that those rights can only be won collectively. But in the attempts to win those rights, many people have been imprisoned and tortured by those who have power and were determined to retain it. In Britain, we don't elect our head of state or the House of Lords, but we do elect members of Parliament.
Spit it out! Come on!
Yet even so, most real power in the world is still exercised by those we do not elect. We are still far from governing ourselves. Money gives power to those who have it, and those who control information still dominate our thinking. And of course, military power has always allowed certain countries to dominate others. That was the basis of the old British Empire, and it's the basis of the new American Empire too. The American Empire is overwhelmingly the most powerful empire the world has ever known. The defense budget of the Pentagon is greater than the 10 next most powerful countries in the world put together. The United States have got 745 bases around the world in 134 countries. This is why a historical perspective is so important, for there are many myths which need to be exposed. The word democracy is a Greek word, and it can be translated into people power. Those in power in ancient Greece realized the best way to defuse criticism was to incorporate the critics by encouraging discussion. And that's exactly what was tried, a sort of early version of the town meeting. And those public meetings, like tribal gatherings in other countries, did allow some sort of consensus to develop. But in Greece, those citizens who were brought in did not include women or the slaves, for they were seen as inferior. One of the myths of English history is that democracy began at the time of Magna Carta. Now, Magna Carta, sometimes spoken of as the birthplace of democracy, is actually rubbish. Magna Carta was a struggle between the king and the landowners. It had nothing to do with the people. The people were entirely excluded. What happened there was that the landowning barons confronted King John, who was a weak man, and demanded greater rights for themselves, and he simply had to give way. The demands were laid out in Magna Carta, which was signed in a field near the small town of Runnymede. There are lots of references to taxation and an attempt to guarantee some basic rights for the powerful. It was laid down that no free man shall be seized or imprisoned except by the lawful judgment of his peers, his equals, or by the law of the land. And to no one will we sell, to no one deny the right of justice. Magna Carta only extended the privileges of democratic power to 25 of the wealthiest landowners. These 5,000 words are supposed to be the basis of modern British democracy, but there's no reference to democracy there at all. The first real turning point came 100 years later with the famous peasants' revolt against the poll tax, which had been levied to pay for a war with France. And when we look back on that story, the man who's remembered is the Reverend John Ball, who was a Christian minister, famous for his sermons which articulated the argument that the peasants were trying to put forward.
He was what was called a hedgerow priest. I didn't quite know what that meant until I looked it up. And he was so controversial, no bishop would give him a parish, so he preached in the hedgerows. And the interesting thing about the Reverend John Ball is that he cited God as the grounds for his campaign for freedom.
And this is what he said. In the beginning we were all created equal. If God willed that there should be serfs, he would have said so at the beginning of the world. We were formed in Christ's likeness, and they treat us like animals. Matters cannot go on well until all things are held in common. The peasants marched on London, occupied the city, and the king promised to accept all their demands. But when the peasants had withdrawn, the king sent his armies out, and thousands of the peasants were slaughtered. And an example was made of John Ball.
The Reverend John Ball was hanged, drawn and quartered. That was the way they did it then. They hung you up till you were almost dead, cut you down while you were still alive, disemboweled you, cut you in 4 bits and put it up on sticks to warn everybody else.
The Peasants' Revolt is remembered because of John Ball's words and the use of the Bible to justify the claims for equality. These ideas have remained ever since and are still powerful today. But the idea that Parliament is the same as democracy is another great myth we ought to look at. Because although earlier in 1295 the first Parliament had been summoned by the king, it only happened because he realized that to retain power he had to create the impression that he recognized the rights of the wealthy by consulting them in a regular way. But of course the common people had no representation whatsoever.
I mean, Parliament, is a French word meaning a talking shop. Parler, you just talk about things, and no power from the people for that. So the confusion of Parliament and democracy is another confusing idea.
Over the centuries, the power of successive kings became stronger and stronger, and it reached a climax in 1649 when there was a civil war between Parliament and King Charles I, sometimes known, and I prefer to think of it as the English Revolution. Cromwell, leading the parliamentary forces, defeated the king. He was executed in Whitehall. And even though the monarchy was restored in 1660, Parliament acquired greater power, though it was still not elected, of course, by the people. Among the many thinkers since 1649 was Tom Paine. Paine was a Republican whose book, The Rights of Man, was burned by the public executioner as seditious. And what Paine said was, government cannot be the property of any particular man or family, but of the whole community. It is wrong to say that God made the rich and poor. He made only male and female, and he gave them the earth for their inheritance. The turning point that led us towards the democracy we now have began as a result of a conflict between the landowners and the workers they employed.
The landowners owned the land and they owned the cottages on the land, so if an individual farm labourer caused trouble or went to complain, he was sacked and evicted from his cottage, and that was the end of the trouble. So the agricultural workers in Dorset in the 1830s realised that if they want to have any power at all, they had to get together. So what the Tolpuddle Martyrs did was they swore an oath of secrecy, so no one would be allowed to know that they'd formed a trade union. Well, those oaths were illegal oaths, so they were taken to the magistrates' court in Dorchester, and they were convicted and sent to Australia to, like, common criminals. There was enormous protest about this, huge demonstrations.
250,000 people signed a petition for their release, and 30,000 people marched down Whitehall in their support. So what had started as a local campaign became a mass movement for the establishment of trade unions. The principle that ordinary people could only achieve their rights by organizing themselves was now established. That's what the protests against the arrests of the Tolpuddle Martyrs achieved.
This was a huge gain for working people. They realized that the laws under which they were governed were made by a totally undemocratic parliament. In 1832, which may seem a long time ago to you, but it was only 18 years before my grandfather was born in 1850, in 1832 only 2% of the population had the vote, and they were all rich men, and they made the laws. And so, following the emergence of trade unionism, came the campaign for the vote, the Chartists.
The really significant political change began when people who had been excluded demanded the right to be represented themselves in Parliament. For over 4 years in cities up and down the country, they worked, and a charter was prepared for the representation of the people. It demanded, for example, that all men should be allowed to vote, and that any man could stand as a member of Parliament. 6 million people signed the charter before it was submitted to Parliament. And, as so often happens in history, the powerful had to concede some of the demands to avoid trouble. More and more people won the vote, and working together, staying united, was what the Chartists discovered was the crucial missing ingredient to force the wealthy to share power.
And you could then see quite clearly what democracy did to the balance of power. Because what democracy did, even in its very elemental form, was to transfer power from the marketplace to the polling station, from the wallet to the ballot. People who didn't have the money were able to vote for candidates who would provide collectively what they couldn't afford personally. All sorts of other economic consequences followed. Municipal schools, municipal hospitals, municipal fire brigade, municipal museums, municipal art galleries.
Of course, many of the advances that were made as a result of local democracy benefited the family and benefited women, but women's rights, which they had demanded right back into the 17th century, were still denied. And as they saw the vote extending to working class men, they said, what about us? And they began to organize separately to win the rights using the same arguments that had been used over the years to win the rights for men.
And the women fought with tremendous force and power, and they chained themselves to the railings. They were arrested, they were put in prison, they went on hunger strike, they were forcibly fed by wardresses, and the government got so frightened at one stage that they passed what became known as the Cat and Mouse Act, under which if a woman was on hunger strike, she was released from prison until she had a meal and then rearrested and put back. The government played like a cat playing with a mouse against those women who were campaigning for the vote. There was one very famous one called Emily Wilding Davison, who in 1911, the year of the census, hid in the House of Commons in a broom cupboard. And then when they said to her, Miss Davison, what was your address on the night of the census? You know, that's the question. She said the House of Commons. And 2 years later, she threw herself at the King's horse at the Derby and died. And I put up a plaque to her in the broom cupboard, had it made myself, screwed it up, didn't get permission, got a photograph of her, and if ever you go to the House of Commons, ask to go to the broom cupboard, because that was a reminder of the struggle women had.
After decades of struggle, women were only given the vote after the First World War in 1918. But they were only allowed to vote at 30. Because men were so arrogant, they thought you can't trust the wife till she's a little bit older. And it wasn't until 1928 that women and men got the vote at the same age. So it had been a long, long battle to get to where we are today. But of course, getting the vote only provides a route to political power, does not provide control of economic power. And as we look at the world today with the economy in the hands of rich and powerful people, you realize that there's a great deal more to be done. And that's what the second half of this program is all about. The war taught us that if you could plan to win victory, you could plan for peace. And in 1945, the people used their votes to elect a new Labour government, which was to institute a series of radical reforms.
I was in the war like many people, and war is 1% danger and 99% boredom, and the rest of the time you talk. And what we said to each other was very simple. I remember it very clearly. We said, if you can have full employment by killing the enemy, why can't you have full employment by building hospitals, building schools, recruiting nurses, recruiting teachers? Why can't you plan for peace in the way you plan for war? And it was that, a popular idea, that won the election. It wasn't the leaders. It wasn't between Churchill, the great war hero, or Attlee, a modest little man. It was because people said, we want a new world.
We want a society of free men and women, free from poverty, free from fear, able to develop to the full their faculties in cooperation with their fellows.
The nation would be turned into a welfare state, providing services for everyone that individually not all could afford. More new homes would be built. Free state schools and university education would be guaranteed as a right. And for the first time, everyone would have the right to a basic standard of health care absolutely free.
this leaflet is coming through your letterbox one day soon. Or maybe you've already had your copy. Read it carefully. It tells you what the new National Health Service is and how you can use what it offers. Hospitals and specialist services, medicines, drugs and appliances.
You couldn't have a more vivid example that in Britain you don't have to be rich to have health care. And it was all set out in a leaflet issued by the Ministry of Health in 1948. Health care is available at the National Health Service free.
Ridding its waiting rooms of the cold, unfriendly atmosphere of the old days, the hospital now boasts all the comforts of a clubroom. Hours of waiting on hard benches are a thing of the past in the hospitals of the future, where they know that the best relief for all ailments is a nice hot cup of tea.
The whole welfare state was the final fruition of the campaign for the vote started by the trade unions through the Chartists and the suffragettes and the representation of working people in Parliament. And it was a huge achievement.
The vote and the right to be represented in a trade union gave people in Britain a form of control over their whole lives. But that wasn't true across the world. For at its height, the British Empire covered 30 million square kilometres and governed almost a quarter of the world's population. But the people of the colonies had no real democratic rights themselves. The British Empire, like all empires before and since, was motivated by a determination to establish imperial control over resources and military bases.
When there was a British Empire, there was absolutely no democracy in the colonies. Empires don't bring democracy, they control people. There was no democracy in India, no democracy in what's now Pakistan, in Burma, in South Africa, and Zimbabwe when we were there.
The effect of this was to produce exactly the same response as the same system had done in Britain. The colonial peoples knew that they too would have to organise to free themselves as we had done in Britain. Meanwhile, while the British people were told that they were carrying the white man's burden and that the sun never set in the British Empire, there were people in Britain who worked as partners with the colonial liberation movements to help them to secure their own independence from the British Empire.
Predictably, as is happening now, anyone who threatens imperial power is treated as if they were, put it mildly, a troublemaker or even a terrorist.
From India to Africa, democratic freedom movements began, and they led to revolts, both peaceful and violent. And most of the leaders ended up in prison.
Mr. Gandhi, whom I met in 1931, he was in and out of prison even though he believed in non-violence. Nehru, the Prime Minister of India, was in and out of prison. I've known all the people I've mentioned myself, and the thing about them is they were described as terrorists. And of course, perhaps the biggest terrorist of all, and I'm quoting Mrs. Thatcher, was Nelson Mandela.
But the forces of organised people behind these leaders was unstoppable, and eventually the colonisers were forced to hand over power. And who did they hand it over to? They handed over to the leaders of the movements who had been called terrorists.
Through Karachi's streets drives the Quaid-e-Azam, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, Pakistan's first Governor-General. It's Karachi's first day of independence, and the crowds are out to greet him and Earl Mountbatten. On his last day as Viceroy, he is here to inaugurate the transfer of power. The garden party at Government House was an informal farewell to British rule in Kenya.
The interesting thing, when you see it properly in its historical context, these people who were seen as troublemakers all ended up having tea with the Queen as head of Commonwealth countries.
The Western example of democracy had spread, but it was no gift of the British or other colonial empires. The rise of democracy among the developing nations was their own achievement. people realised that it made rational sense for as many people as possible to be involved in decisions, and that a tiny elite in power will only look after themselves. They believed intuitively that they were the equals of their colonial masters, and they had seen the power of organised rebellion. Back in Britain, the impact of democracy was felt as an achievement by the people who'd fought for it. The inequality between rich and poor narrowed, life expectancy went up, wages and standard of living was increased, people had more leisure time, and though life was far from perfect, there was an optimism in the 60s and the 70s that society was heading in the right direction.
And so they come to a beach which is far from lonely now, to find a place in the sun, to stretch their legs and doze in a sweltering paradise where the office and the washing up of forgotten things, sandcastles come out just right.
The pressure from the people to change society through democracy was never relaxed. By electing Labour governments dedicated to representing everyone in Parliament, and through protest, Britain went through 20 years of quite considerable social progress. And by the 1970s, it looked as if we had a potential to carry that democratic revolution even further.
In the period of the 1980s, there was a major counter-revolution against democracy. President Reagan in America, Mrs. Thatcher in Britain, I think they realised that if there wasn't something done to change it, democracy would succeed, and they said, we're not having that.
There was a deliberate attempt, in my opinion, to dismantle some of the democratic machinery which we'd built up for ourselves. Publicly owned industries, which had been run for the good of the entire country, were privatised or in some cases shut down. The power of local government and of the trade unions was consciously and deliberately undermined. And even the greatest triumph of people power, the welfare state, began to be pulled back, and the National Health Service was undoubtedly crippled by underfunding, and the pensions linked to earnings were abolished. But of course it was not only in Britain that things were changing, because if you take a broader perspective, there was a massive technological and economic and industrial change taking place across the world. And as trade and industry grew worldwide, a whole series of institutions came to be set up designed to serve their interests.
What's now called globalization. And when they say globalization, it's a funny word because a capital can move to where the wages are lower, and they call that free trade. But if people in poorer countries want to come and live in our country where the wages are higher, oh no, they're kept out by immigration control.
The World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, the European Commission, none of these are elected, and yet they have growing power now to dictate to the governments that are elected. And for them, privatisation and profit are the main objectives, regardless of the social cost.
And increasingly, any government, and certainly I experienced it when I was there, feel they're under massive pressure to do what international capital wants. And to take a very vivid example, debt relief. The IMF goes to countries in Africa and says, we will only relieve your debt if you privatise your health and education, which means huge profits for the multinational companies that take over those responsibilities.
So it's true to say that power is moving back from the polling station to the marketplace, from the ballot to the wallet.
The sales of the top 200 corporations represent a quarter of all world economic activity. There are $500 billionaires, and they have wealth equal to the income of half the world's population. Although globalization is justified in terms of economic advance, it has actually widened the gap between rich and poor, worldwide and even in Britain.
And these ideas are, of course, closely associated with the very powerful neoconservatives in the United States as their empire builds up. And of course the big multinational corporations have found a way of developing their political power by funding political parties, buying them and then expecting a payoff whichever one wins. So there is less and less choice for the electors. If we allow business interests on an international scale to dominate, we shall find we've surrendered all the rights to those with money, which would be a throwback to the Dark Ages.
And now, increasingly, people are being managed and not represented. And somehow that is an issue that has to be tackled, because if we don't provide a democratic opportunity, one of three things will happen. Either people will become cynical, and cynicism destroys politics and opens the way to dictatorship, or they will just abstain, which will destroy the legitimacy of elected governments, or they'll turn to violence, because the history of the world has been a history of violence, and sometimes, indeed many times, it's been discovered the only way to resolve that is to provide democratic rights.
And there are some long overdue constitutional changes we should make in Britain.
I think we should elect our head of state. I'm not one of those who criticises the Queen because she didn't pick the job. But why shouldn't we elect our head of state to represent us? And if the Queen lived at Buckingham Palace and changed the Guard funded by the British Tourist and Holiday Board, fine, that's great. Not an attack on the royal family, but we ought to elect our head of state.
The real problem is that all the powers of the Crown, the so-called Crown prerogatives, are exercised by the Prime Minister, and he doesn't have to consult Parliament at all. And these powers include the right to go to war, to sign treaties, to make appointments, just like the medieval king. If there's one lesson to be learned from the past, it is that all real progress comes from below. And that means we have to organise. It was, of course, through self-organisation that Parliament itself was forced to grant the vote to everyone and then accept the welfare state.
I think we have to fight again for the right of working people to organise themselves in trade unions, not just nationally, but internationally.
I think it can be done because this generation understands better than any of the previous generations what's going on. The internet helps them to understand what's happening and helps them to organise. And these great big global movements that are building up are based on the idea that you'll never have peace if you don't have social justice, respect human rights, work internationally, and build democracy. So this generation has got to take on itself the responsibility for carrying the campaign for democracy from the national to the international scale.
I mean, a couple of million people in London in 2003 at the time of the Iraq War, and similarly there were demonstrations in the United States, all over Europe, all over the world, against the war. And this really represents a movement as powerful, in my opinion, as potentially powerful as the Chartists and the trade unions were in the early 19th century. Now, this is a phenomenon that people in power will have to think about, because if those in power think they can forever disregard those they govern, they will make a great mistake. No one in power really wants democracy, because democracy would challenge their power structures and their authority. So anyone who comes out with a democratic idea is dismissed as unrepresentative or a troublemaker or an extremist or something. And in this way, the full flow of a public debate about alternatives is being extinguished. We're the first generation in the whole of human history that has the money and the technology to resolve the world's problems. And we pour it in to nuclear weapons and wars, whereas a fraction of the budget spent on the Iraq War could transform the prospects for Africa, for example. It's an old progressive saying, we are many, they are few. But if you want to do it, you've got to do it yourself. No good waiting for some new leader to gallop onto the stage on a white horse and wave at you and say, vote for me and I'll solve your problems. That's no solution. You have to do it yourself.
The human race are like survivors in a lifeboat with one loaf of bread. There are only three ways of distributing it. You sell it so the rich gobble it up. You fight for it so the strong get it all. Or you share it. And that is the choice we have to make. And that can only really be done in a democratic world. And that's why democracy is worth working for.
So why was the stone circle built and what was it used for? On the day of the summer solstice, we join John Suchet and Kate Sanderson for Stonehenge Live, coming up in just a moment on 5.